Hello again. I'm Dr. Ron Traylor, and welcome back to Political Science 201. This is video number 4. Now, as we were ending video number 3, we were discussing the writing of the Declaration of Independence. And we were talking about the so-called Committee of Five, who had been given the task of writing the document, and how 4 of them deferred to the 5th man, whose name was Thomas Jefferson, and gave him the task of really creating the first draft. Now, of course, the name Thomas Jefferson should be familiar to each and every one of us. One of the most famous men in American history, a man who accomplished so much in his life. Now, let's talk about the things that he accomplished. And this is an incomplete list. These are just the things that pop into my mind just right off the top of my head. He had served as the governor of Virginia. He had served as the American ambassador to the nation of France. He had served as George Washington's Secretary of State. He had served as John Adams's vice president. He would be elected twice to the presidency himself. So, any one of those things would have meant, for me at least, to be the height of a lifetime of achievement. But for Jefferson, it was just one item on a long list of things. Jefferson was a unique individual. Now, those are the things that we think are important. Let's ask a fundamental question. What did Jefferson think what were the most important things in his mind? Well, we know what they are, because on his tombstone, when he passed away in 1824, by the way, on his tombstone, he gave orders to etch in the tombstone what he considered to be his 3 most important accomplishments. He didn't mention being president of the United States. He didn't mention being Secretary of State. He didn't mention being ambassador to France. He didn't mention being vice president to Adams. He listed his authorship of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom as one of his 3 main accomplishments. Jefferson felt very strongly that the United States should not support any particular religion. There's a fancy word for that. It's called the establishment of religion. And what that means is that it doesn't matter what your religion is, you are going to pay taxes, and some of your tax money is going to be used to support a particular church. Well, Jefferson totally opposed that. He said that there should be free exercise of religion, but that the government should not establish, there's that word again, should not establish a specific religion to which it sent our tax money. Okay, that's the first on the list. Then Jefferson had helped establish the University of Virginia. I've been told, I've never visited his home, but I've been told that from the front porch of his home, you can look across the valley and see the roofs of the buildings of the University of Virginia. He totally supported the establishment of that university. As a matter of fact, he donated much of his personal and private library to the newly founded University of Virginia to serve as the foundation for their library. So that's the second thing he was very proud of. And what was the third thing? Well, his creation of the draft of the Declaration of Independence. Now, to Jefferson, the contents of the Declaration of Independence were not too revolutionary. In an 1825 letter to Richard Henry Lee, remember Richard Henry Lee? He was the guy who had stood up during the Second Continental Congress and said that we had a right to be free. Same guy. In an 1825, let me back up. I said a few moments ago that he died in 1824. That's incorrect. It was 1826. So please make that change in your notes. Okay. In 1825, he wrote a letter to Richard Henry Lee, and in that letter, he talked about his purpose in writing the Declaration. He said, and I quote, its purpose was to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. And what was the subject? Independence. To place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, their agreement. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind. Now, if you'll forgive me, and I hope that Jefferson would forgive me, I disagree with his assessment. I think it was revolutionary. Uh, the idea that a colony of the world's most powerful nation, which at that time was England, that a colony would have the audacity, would have the courage to declare their independence and be willing to fight a war for their independence was unheard of. Now, historians and political scientists are pretty much in agreement that there are two two major parts to the Declaration of Independence, two purposes, if you will, for the Declaration. The first purpose was to explain to foreign nations why the colonies were declaring their independence. Now, remember, this was unheard of at the time. And so Jefferson felt an obligation to explain to the other nations of the world why we were taking such a radical step. In the Declaration, Jefferson spoke of ideas that are common today, especially in the Western world, but that were rather new in the late 18th century. He spoke of unalienable rights that were granted by God rather than granted by man. Even though most Englishmen were familiar with the types of rights that he mentioned in the Declaration, he abandoned forevermore the more narrow idea of the rights of Englishmen. Remember, we said that in 1619, the British government had voluntarily told the English colonies in North America that just because they were 4,000 miles away from England did not change the fact that they were Englishmen with the rights of Englishmen. Jefferson abandons that term, Englishmen with the rights of Englishmen. And rather, in the Declaration, he talks about the rights of men. The idea of all men is the specific quote. Now, what are some of these rights that all men have, according to Jefferson? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are some of the rights that all men around the world are not. They not only have those rights, but those rights are given to them by God. In the Declaration, Jefferson also spoke of the consent of the governed. Why is that there? What does that mean? What it means is that The government that we have is the style of government that the people want, and that uh, the people have a role in their government. Of course, how do we express our views? By voting. Some governments try to enforce their conception of the will of God. Other nations, into their constitutions, try to build up certain leaders. That's especially true in places like China and Iran and North Korea. Jefferson viewed the goal of government as a tool for securing the rights of the people. God had granted those rights, but just because God had granted the right didn't mean that the people were able to exercise that right. Jefferson said that government, it should be the job of government to guarantee those God given rights. He claimed that power comes not through the king, not through the queen, not through the dukes and the earls and the princes, no, or from a dictator. No, what Jefferson says was that um, power came from the consent of the government. I'm sorry, the consent of the governed. In other words, the people. The people. The power rests in the hands of the people. Now, Jefferson continued in that first part of the Declaration by saying that when governments, now remember what he's already said, he said that the purpose of government is to make sure that the rights that are given to the people by God are honored. Then, Jefferson said, when a government does not give to the people those God given rights, then the people may rightfully change or overthrow their own government. He included a warning, though, that overthrowing your government should not be taken lightly. It is not, it is significant. It is a weighty matter when the people rise up and replace the government that they have. What Jefferson says is that you don't revolt against the king just because you don't like the way he parts his hair or something, right? It's got to be something really, really important. And not only must it be really, really important, a pattern must have been established by the king or by the parliament or by the rulers uh, that consistently attempts to take away God given rights. But he said that when that does happen, when a pattern is established, a long standing pattern is established, then not only should the people revolt, but they must. Now, Jefferson then turns his attention in the Declaration to the second purpose of the Declaration, and that was to create a list of the abuses that had been perpetrated by the king and by the parliament on the British North American colonists over a period of time. Now, although Jefferson never practiced law, he was trained as a lawyer. And this second part of the Declaration of Independence reads like a legal brief. Uh, in in this second part, uh, Jefferson lists all of the bad things that the British government has done to its British North American colonists. Specifically, it's a long list. He showed that despite this long list of abuses, that the colonists had been patient, that they had been long suffering, and that they had been peaceful in their attempts to get the British government to change its attitude toward the colonists. And of course, then he says, all those attempts have failed. And so he ends the Declaration of Independence with an appeal to God to be a witness to the colonists' good intentions, good motives, honorable motives. And then at the very last, he incorporates that quote from Richard Henry Lee. Remember what Lee had said? He said that these colonies have a right to be free. He quotes Richard Henry Lee. Now, what he actually did, he plagiarized Richard Henry Lee. If Jefferson had been in my class and had written that without giving Lee credit, I would have given him an F for plagiarism. But Richard Henry Lee was probably very proud that his own words were quoted by Jefferson, even though Jefferson didn't give him credit for those words. Now, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. Just 2 days after voting to accept Lee's early resolution that it was time for us to receive our independence from England. Now, one of the most famous paintings in American history hangs in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., and it is a depiction of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And in that picture is a painting of each of the men who signed the Declaration as they're signing it. They're all there, and they're sort of standing in line waiting to sign it. That did not happen. What did happen was, remember, the men who had created, the members of the Second Continental Congress who approved the Declaration of Independence were important men. They were substantial men. They were businessmen, and they were doctors and lawyers and judges and academic people. There were very few what we would consider to be middle class people. These were the elites of American society. And because they were the elites of American society, they had responsibilities back home. And so, if you were a member of the Second Continental Congress, that meant that you spent some of your time in Philadelphia, and then you would leave and go back home and take care of your business matters there. Very few times was every member of the Second Continental Congress who signed the Declaration. Very seldom were they all there at one time. And so that painting is historically inaccurate, but it does show the faces of the men who, in fact, did eventually sign it. It took a few months, by the way, for the last guy who signed it to sign it. Something else that is very disappointing to me at times. We as Americans have lost track of how radical declaring our independence was. Remember, we were a colony of England. England was the most powerful nation in the world at that time. And there is no way that we should have won that war. But we'll talk about it a little later. But we did win it, didn't we? But no nation in the world could have predicted that we would have won that war. It was probably a foregone conclusion that we were not only going to lose the American Revolution, but we were going to lose it badly. Benjamin Franklin was a member of the Second Continental Congress. He was also a member of that Committee of Five that created the Declaration of Independence. And Franklin was a very wise man. He also had a really good sense of humor, and he combined those two traits, those two characteristics, Now, the story is told that as Franklin stepped up to the table and took the pen in his hand to sign the Declaration of Independence, he turned to his colleagues in the Second Continental Congress and he said, "Gentlemen, we must now hang together, or we most assuredly will hang separately." And this is one of the things that we've lost track of. That these men who signed that Declaration of Independence literally were putting their lives on the line. If the United States had failed to win the American Revolution, uh, I suspect that uh, the first 5 members of the Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, who would have been executed, hung by their necks until they were dead, the first 5 to be executed probably would have been members of the Committee of 5. And at the head of that 5, probably Thomas Jefferson would have been the very, very first one to have been hung. So Franklin was not exaggerating when he said, if we don't hang together, we're going to hang separately. Because that probably, that was the penalty for treason. And many people in England called the revolutionaries, they called the people that we call patriots, they called them traitors. Okay. So it didn't take us long to go through the Declaration of Independence. I didn't want to get into the details of it. I simply wanted to give you an overview of it, and I think that that is sufficient for our needs. The second, so that's the first of the 3 documents that we were going to discuss. The second of the so-called founding documents, we're going to spend considerably more time on. And that document is called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation came into existence in 1777. And many historians consider the Articles of Confederation to really be America's first constitution. The Articles of Confederation were in effect until they were replaced by our present day Constitution that was ratified in 1789. The period of time during which the nation operated under the Articles of Confederation, historians generally refer to that time period as the critical period in American history. It was given that name, by the way, by a very young John Quincy Adams, the son of President John Adams and a future president himself. When he graduated from Harvard, he gave the commencement address and he spoke about the Articles of Confederation and referred to that time period as the critical period. And the name stuck, or the phrase stuck. Now, what was the structure of the Articles of Confederation? Well, it did not. It did a lot of things, but there were things that it didn't do because it couldn't do. For example, there was no executive branch created by the Articles of Confederation. And what that means, very simply, is that there was no president of the United States because the president is the leader of the executive branch. Without the president, there can be no executive branch. This was no accident. To create a government that did not have someone fulfilling the responsibilities of a president was no accident. By the time the Articles of Confederation were written, many people had a really bad taste in their mouth over the King of England, George III. And to have created the office of the president probably would have reminded people of not just the power of the King of England, but the abuse of power by the King of England. And so we did not want to repeat history, and so we did not create an executive branch. So let me say it very clearly. There was no president of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. Neither was there a judicial branch. Today we have three branches of government. Most of you know this. There is the executive branch, which is the president and his cabinet and his advisors. There is the legislative branch, which is the Congress, two-part Congress, the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And the third branch of government is the judicial branch. It's the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but lower courts as well. The Articles of Confederation did not create a judicial branch. Fundamentally, the Articles of Confederation had only one branch, and that was the legislative branch. So, no executive branch, no president, no judicial branch, no federal courts, only the legislative branch, and even it was different. It only had one chamber. Once again, let me repeat myself. Our present day legislative branch has two chambers. It has the House of Representatives and the the U.S. Senate. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was only one branch, and they referred to it simply as the Congress. The Congress. So the Congress was the government under the Articles of Confederation. Why didn't they create a judicial branch? Well, remember, our country was young, it was small. Uh, there were about 10 million people living in the entire country, and each colony had its own colonial court system. And once we became a nation, those same courts continued to exist. They just changed the name of them, right? They changed it from the colony of Maryland court to the state of Maryland court system. And there were so few people that the men who wrote the Articles of Confederation figured that the existing court system would be able to handle any legal problems that might come up in the future. So, no judicial branch. I said that there was no House of Representatives, there was no Senate, there was only one branch, and that was called the Congress. Now, there's another word to describe that type of government where there's only one, where the legislative branch only consists of one part. That's called a unicameral legislature. Let me spell that one for you. Unicameral. Unicameral. It's taken from the Latin. Una means one. Camera means chamber. So a unicameral legislature means a legislature with one chamber. The Articles of Confederation gave very little power to the national government. And it's easy to understand why they did that. The British government that they had to fight for their independence had a very strong centralized government headed by the king and by the parliament. And it had been the king and the parliament that had caused all of our problems. And once again, we didn't want anything to do with that. We didn't want to make those same mistakes here as we created this new country. And so, to keep the government, the Congress, from getting too powerful, getting too big, the powers of the Congress were strictly limited. It had very few powers. Now, it did have some powers, and some of the powers were important. For example, the Articles gave to the Congress the power to declare war and to make peace, which means that they had the power to create and approve treaties. Congress could authorize diplomacy. They could appoint ambassadors. They could promote military officers. But there were severe limitations on what the Congress could do. For example, they could create a tax, but they didn't have the power to collect the tax. That makes no sense to us today, does it? But it made logical sense to them back then. In order to collect taxes required that the Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, work very closely with state legislatures. It had to really be a partnership to convince the state legislatures to pay their fair share of the taxes because they had the legal right to say no. And since the national government did not have the power to, they only had the power to create the tax, but not the power to collect it. Now, there were some responsibilities that were given to the national government that no one complained about. For example, the national government, under the Articles of Confederation, were given the power to coin and print money. Now, can you imagine how confusing it would have been if each state had created its own coins and its own cash, right? How would you regulate that? How would you determine what the value of a coin or a piece of paper money was? And so, to avoid that problem, that responsibility was given strictly to the national government. In a similar fashion, uh, the Postal Service was created, and responsibility for delivering the mail was given to the national government. Once again, can you imagine how confusing it would be if every state um, had stamps of different values, had different rules concerning the delivery of the mail? Oh God, it would have been so confusing. And so everyone pretty much agreed that that job should be in the hands of the national government. The national government, under the Articles of Confederation, also had the responsibility for making decisions governing the so-called Western lands. Now, we've not talked about this yet, so let's talk about it for a little bit. Now, the original 13 colonies that became the original 13 states generally were up on the Atlantic coast, right? On the Atlantic coast. But when the American Revolution ended, the United States received from England a lot of extra land. As a matter of fact, the United States, once the war was over, the United States boundaries went all the way it went so far west that it didn't stop until it got to the Mississippi River. It went so far south that it didn't stop until it hit the northern border of Spanish West Florida. Okay, now let me explain this. Where does the United States, where is the United States southern border today? Well, it's at the Gulf of Mexico. Not then, though. That's the way it is now, but certainly not then, because Florida was owned by Spain. And at that time, Florida didn't stop over around between Mobile and Pensacola like it does today. Florida went all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. So the southern boundary of the United States was not the Gulf of Mexico. It was the northern border of Spanish Florida. And the northern border was fundamentally the southern border of Canada. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because uh, on paper, people said, well, the northern boundary of the United States is the southern boundary of Canada. But nobody was really sure where the southern boundary of Canada was. And so this is going to require some diplomatic effort to settle that question, but that's coming down the road a few years. If a member of the Articles of Confederation Congress, let's do it this way. Members of the Articles of Confederation Congress were chosen by the legislatures of the state that they represented. All right. If I'm a member of the Articles of Congress from Massachusetts, the legislature of the state of Massachusetts chooses me to serve. Now, usually the guy who can hire you is also the guy who can fire you, and that's exactly what the case was here. States could also recall members of the Articles of Confederation Congress if that member didn't do what the state who he represented wanted him to do. Each state, no matter how large or how small, had one vote in the Articles of Confederation Congress. Some states were rather large, like Virginia and Pennsylvania, pretty big places, but they only had one vote. Other states were rather small. I mean, Rhode Island, Delaware, Vermont, they also had one vote. So every state had one vote and one vote only. Didn't matter what your physical size was, and it didn't matter what your population size was. One vote only. In order to make decisions, usually required that 9 out of the 13 states agree on an issue before it could become law. Certain things, though, required here's a new word for you, unanimity. UNANIMITY, unanimity. And as the word suggests, some things required a unanimous agreement among the 13 states. In order to amend the Constitution, required unanimity. In order to create certain taxes, required unanimity. And let me tell you this, the Articles of Confederation were never, ever amended. Why? Because it took unanimity to do it, and the 13 states squabbled like school children. And as a result, they could never reach a unanimous verdict, and so there were never any amendments to the Articles of Confederation, and that will play a huge role in the future in the ultimate creation of the Constitution that we still operate under today. Now, as weak as it was, despite the lack of authority that the Articles of Confederation generally had, it did accomplish a number of really important things. First of all, it concluded the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The Treaty of Paris was the treaty between England and the United States that ended the American Revolution. It was negotiated in the city of Paris, hence it being called the Treaty of Paris. Let me say it again. Treaty of Paris ends the American Revolution. But before the treaty can become official, it has to be approved of by the Articles of Confederation Congress, and they do that. So, one of the most important accomplishments of the Articles of Congress was it was instrumental in concluding the American Revolution by approving the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Some of the other accomplishments of the Articles of Congress, Articles of Confederation Congress, I'm sorry. It was under their authority that the first departments of the government were first created. The Department of what was called the Department of Foreign Affairs, which is what we would call the State Department. It was created under the guidance of the Articles of Confederation Congress. The Department of Finance, what we would now call the Treasury Department, was also created under the authority given by the Articles of Confederation Congress. and the War Department, which we now call the Defense Department, in a similar fashion, was brought into existence by the Articles of Confederation Congress. And something else that the Articles of Confederation did, it created the principles of land distribution and territorial government that continued to guide expansion all the way to the Pacific Ocean. We will talk shortly about this piece of legislation called the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance was important for several reasons. First of all, the Northwest Ordinance banned the institution of slavery in certain states. We will talk a lot more about that. But it also created the pathway that a territory could take to become a state. And both of those things, the banning of slavery in certain parts of the country and the rules for becoming a state, were both addressed in the Northwest Ordinance, which was created by the Articles of Confederation Congress. So the Articles Congress did accomplish some important work. Now, the Articles of let me repeat myself because this is extraordinarily important. The Articles of Confederation intentionally created a weak government. I remember when I was a child, right? That's been a long time ago, folks. But when I was a child, my mother would punish me for something maybe that I didn't do. You probably can sympathize with that. It's probably happened to you too. And I remember saying, boy, when I get big and I have kids, I'm not going to treat them like they're treating me, right? Looking back on the time period during which the Articles of Confederation were in effect, it's easier now to see the defects of the Articles than it was then to see the defects of the Articles. What's the old saying? Hindsight is always 2020. Nevertheless, um, the government had been created intentionally weak because we didn't want anything to ever happen in the United States like had happened in England with a strong king and a strong uh, parliament, which was the basis of the British government. It was a strong central government, and we didn't want that because that strong central government had caused us all these problems. So we probably went too far in the other direction, to be quite honest with you. We created this weak, decentralized, and almost from the very beginning, some Americans began to realize that they probably had made a mistake by creating a weak, decentralized government. And as the years passed, more and more and more and more Americans came to agree with that assessment that the Articles of Confederation, which were created in good faith, nevertheless were not capable of getting the job of government done. Plus, um, as the years passed, uh, people began to forget that they had once called the King of England a tyrant, that they had once called the members of the Parliament tyrants. Um, because one of the first things that happened after the American Revolution ended was the 2 nations reconciled. Uh, we, we have never had a closer ally than England. And even though we eventually had to fight a second war against them, and we called that war the War of 1812, nevertheless, the reality is that the British, for most of our history, including up until today, have always had our back. And so some Americans began to question the effectiveness of the Articles of Confederation. Now, remember, please, that I said that very few powers were given to the Articles of Confederation Congress. That's true. I stand by that. The reality is that even though very few powers were given to the Congress, the states began to take even those powers away from the Congress. I'll give you an example. John Adams, who had helped write the Declaration of Independence, he was one of the Committee of Five. John Adams was named as a economic ambassador, a trade ambassador to England. So Adams goes to England, and he walks into the office of the British official that he was planning to meet. And when he walked into the outer office, he looked around. There were a bunch of men sitting there waiting for an appointment, and he knew most of them. They were Americans from different states of the Union. And when he asked them what they were doing there, they said, quite honestly, we're here to negotiate a good deal for our state, for South Carolina, or for Virginia, or for Pennsylvania, or for New Hampshire. Adams was ushered into the office of this British official, and the official was rather upset. And Adams says, "What's going on? Why are you upset? I've done nothing wrong to offend you, have I?" He said, "No." He said, "You haven't." But he said, "What?" He said, "I'm not going to talk to any of you guys. I'm not going to negotiate with any of you people. All of you, including you, you should go home and figure out who is in charge of this insane asylum. Do your Articles of Confederation give the national government the power to negotiate treaties, or doesn't it? And if it doesn't, you need to send all these guys home. And if it does, we'll ignore the national government and we'll deal with the individual states on an individual basis." These problems, that problem, and problems similar to that, grew more and more disruptive. Arguments over who has what power became more and more common. In the year 1785, a group of men from two states, Virginia and Maryland, met at George Washington's home, Mount Vernon in Virginia, to discuss some problems that the two states had in common. Now, look on a map. Virginia and Maryland are next door neighbors. They are divided by the Potomac River. I mean, basically, it's the same place. The soil is similar. The crops were similar. They were both slave states. And so they had a lot of common interests. And so but they had problems as well. And so delegates from the two states meet at Mount Vernon to try to iron out these problems. And what the problems were are not really important to us today. What is important is that there were problems, and these two states met to try to resolve the problems, and they did. And once the meeting was over, very successful meeting, One of the Virginia delegates, a young man by the name of James Madison, invited. He said, now, I'm sure that his speech was much more formal than my informal speech, but here was the gist of it. He said, "Hey guys, what's up? Right? We had a good meeting, didn't we, guys? We accomplished a lot. Why wouldn't it be great if we could have a meeting that involved delegates from all 13 of the states to settle some of our differences uh, and work things out to our mutual satisfaction?" And so, now remember, this meeting that we now call the Mount Vernon meeting took place in 1785. The delegates to the Mount Vernon meeting thought that Madison's idea was a good idea, and so invitations were sent out to each of the 13 states, announcing that a meeting was going to be held in 1786, 1 year later, in Annapolis, Maryland. And hopefully, what had been accomplished at the meeting between Virginia and Maryland could be accomplished between delegates of all 13 of the states. Now, this meeting, which we obviously call the Annapolis meeting, did in fact take place, but only delegates from 5 states showed up. But nevertheless, it was a success. They did iron out some of the problems that the states were having between themselves. And at the end of the Annapolis meeting, a young delegate from the state of New York, whose name was Alexander Hamilton, stood up and basically said, "We've had a really successful meeting. Why don't we send a letter to the Articles of Confederation Congress asking that they give their blessing to a meeting next year in 1787? And the purpose of that meeting will be to solve some of these problems that we're having with the Articles of Confederation. Who's in charge?" And it was approved. The letter was approved, and it was sent to the Articles of Confederation Congress. And surprisingly, the Articles of Confederation Congress gave its approval for that meeting. So, in 1787, in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, this meeting took place. Now, we know, let me spoil the story for you. We now refer to that meeting as the Constitutional Convention. But it was not designed to be a constitutional convention. Because what the Constitutional Convention ultimately did was it threw out the Articles of Confederation and created a brand spanking new document, the Constitution. But that was not the purpose of the meeting in Philadelphia. The original meeting, the purpose of that original meeting was much simpler than writing a new document. It was to try to fix the problems that were contained in the Articles of Confederation. It was an attempt to fix the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, but it led to the Articles of Confederation being thrown out and a new document being written. Let me say this again. The original purpose of what we now call the Constitutional Convention was not to write a constitution. It was to fix the shortcomings of the old Articles of Confederation. Now, let's talk about some of the men who attend, and I'm going to go ahead and start calling it the Constitutional Convention, even though they weren't calling it that at the time. Okay, let's talk about some of the men who attended the Constitutional Convention. Well, 55 men eventually attended the Constitutional Convention. Some only made a few meetings. Some, like Madison, were there for pretty much every one of them. Most of them were in and out of Philadelphia because, as I said before, these were important men and they had responsibilities back home, and so they were in and out with regularity. But 55 uh, in total attended the Constitutional Convention and participated in its workings. 39 of the 55 eventually signed the Constitution. And we will talk about the missing, who are the missing 16? Okay, 55 attend, but only 39 sign it. Why? Why would they work so hard and then refuse to sign it? Well, we'll talk about that. Once again, almost every delegate there was an important guy. He was a big shot. He was a member of early American movers and the shakers, the elites of society. Only 2 of the 55 were small farmers. Most of them, once again, were planters and merchants and lawyers and bankers and judges. Some of them had attended college. Some of them had never darkened the door of a college classroom, but they all shared something in common. First of all, they were bright, 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 smart, smart, smart. And even those who had never attended college were well read. They knew a lot about a lot of different stuff. They knew a lot about law. They knew a lot about philosophy. They knew a lot about history. Many of them were American Revolution veterans. 21. 21 of the 55 had actually fought in the American Revolution. They knew what gunpowder smoke smelled like. They knew they were familiar with the sounds of agony from wounded comrades. 7 of them had been a state governor at one time or another. Most of them had served in either the First or the Second Continental Congress. Some had served in both. 8 of them had actually signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Now, Washington was there. He really didn't participate in the debate, but he still served an important purpose. Washington was the moderator, if you will, of the convention. It was Washington who stood up in the front. It was Washington who said, "Okay, it's your turn to talk. Okay, you talked long enough. Sit down. Let the other guy talk some more." Okay, he was the guy up in front, sort of. He was like an orchestra conductor. He was conducting uh, the Constitutional Convention. Ben Franklin was there. By the time Ben Franklin was 81 years old. And in those days, with the life expectancy in the 40s and 50s, Ben Franklin was an anomaly. He was unique to have survived to the age of 81. It's unheard of in those days. And Ben Franklin, as usual, offered common sense uh, and a really dry sense of humor. James Madison was there. And by the way, Washington is from Virginia. Franklin is from Pennsylvania. James Madison is from Virginia. James Madison was the son of a wealthy Virginia tobacco farmer. He was the oldest son, and so he knew that he had it made. Right? He was never going to have to go out and find a job. He would be able to, if he chose to, he would be able to live in the lap of luxury. But Madison didn't want to be a tobacco farmer. What he really wanted to do was to be a politician. And that is back in the days when the word politician didn't have that negative meaning that it has today. Oh, he's a politician. What does that mean? Well, you can't trust him. No, 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 no. Back in those days, uh, he chose to be a politician because he wanted to help his country grow. Another man who played an important role at the Constitutional Convention was a man by the name of Roger Sherman. He was from the state of Connecticut. And Sherman was of great value at the convention because he had a real talent for compromise. Whenever it seemed that the two sides on an issue had approached a stalemate and nothing was going to break the stalemate, Sherman had this unbelievable ability to bring both sides to the compromise table and solve or resolve their issues. Now, there were certain people who were not there, certain important Americans who were not there. John Adams was not there, uh, but for good reason. He was serving as the United States ambassador to England. Thomas Jefferson was not there for good reason. He was serving as the U.S. ambassador to France. So Adams was in London and Jefferson was in Paris. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, um, served at the convention, but he served very little. Hamilton had a really very difficult personality. He was brilliant, but he was confrontational, and he liked to have things his way. And so he had offered a few suggestions early in the convention, and those suggestions had been rejected. Nothing personal, right? But he took it personally. And basically, he walked out in a snit because people wouldn't do it the way he wanted to do it. I have always wondered. And so, in many ways, Hamilton really didn't make a contribution to the original Constitution. And I've often wondered how much better would the Constitution have ultimately been if Hamilton had swallowed his pride, right, and stayed and made other contributions. Well, we'll never know. The convention lasted about 4 months. It began in the late spring of 1787, and it went into the summer. It was an extraordinarily hot summer. There was a plague of flies. Nasty, nasty creatures, aren't they? Um, the delegates worked 5 and 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. Why not 7 days? Well, because they still honored the Sabbath back in those days. And they hammered out the compromises that led to the Constitution of 1787. All right, that's a good place to stop. That's a minute and 3 seconds or so. So that was lecture number 4, and we will pick it up with lecture 5 um, in the nuts and the bolts of the creation of the Constitution. And until then, I'll see you.